Today on Muddy Bear's 4x4, the 1-ton swap is getting some custom-made steering. Hello everyone and welcome to Muddy Bear's 4x4. I am Robbie and today we are going to be building a steering system for our 1-ton axle swap on the Trailplug, my 1999 Jeep Cherokee XJ. Now this is going to be a custom build. There is not really a bolt-on kit for something like this where you're swapping in an axle, but what I do have is a couple DIY kits from Barnes 4-wheel drive that should make building this pretty simple. So to start with, we have one of their just simple crossover style steering kits. Now this comes with 4 different 7/8 Heim joints, a bunch of variation of your different misalignment spacers and all that kind of stuff to set up your system. And then it also comes with 2 left-hand and 2 right-hand weld-in bungs. That way you can make your steering adjustments, and of course the jam nuts as well. And I really like this style of weld-in bung because it has the grooves in it to get a wrench on, which makes it a lot easier to tighten up those jam nuts. You can also order the DOM tubing for this kit straight from Barnes as well. So that's a pretty simple setup. Now the other kit is one of their DIY track bar / panhard kits, and very similar. It comes with 2 Heim joints and then a couple left-hand thread, or I'm sorry, 1 left-hand thread and 1 right-hand thread, weld-in bung and jam nut. But this kit also comes with a couple other options. You can order it without, or just one or the other, or both. Brackets. So there is a frame side bracket that you can order. As you can see, it comes in a couple pieces here. You got to kind of put it together. I chose the one that's sort of offset up against or away from the axle that pushes that track bar out a little bit. And again, they have a couple options. So there's actually a drop-down menu. You can choose which bracket you think is going to work best for your system. Now, I might not use that axle side bracket, but for sure, I'm going to be using this. Now, this is the frame side bracket that comes with that DIY track bar kit. And again, they have a couple options. This one is designed to actually kick out the outboard of the frame, and I believe the other option is where you can make it, I think, inboard of the frame. Now, both of these, of course, come with a bunch of different mounting holes, so again, we can adjust the track bar so we can make sure all of our steering geometry and angles is where we want it. And of course, again, you can order the tube with it. I got a stick of this. It's quarter wall DOM tubing for my track bar and for both of my steering links. So we got quite a bit of work ahead of us, but with these 2 DIY kits, I think this should not be too big a deal to set up. So let's get to work. Well, check it out, everyone. I managed to get all the different steering components mounted up and then mocked into place using some PVC pipe, just so that we can see how everything is going to lay out and get a good idea of how we're going to build this. Now, building a custom steering setup like this is really not that complicated, but there are still a few things we should consider while building this to make sure that we have our steering geometry right and that we're not going to have any binding, and there still could be a few packaging constraints that we might run into. So I am using a weld-on high steer kit from a company called Beyond Precise Off-Road. Now, this is a pretty standard type of kit that you can find for these Super Duty knuckles, and it gives us a few mounting options for our tie rod and drag link. Now, I opted to go with mounting them parallel with the tie rod on the outside to give us plenty of clearance, and then mounting the drag link to the inside here of the steering arm here on the knuckle. Now, this particular steering arm kit, or high steer kit, actually came with this extra bracket that we could have welded up to the top and then mounted our drag link up here, essentially making that double shear, and I would have then stacked my 2 my 2 Heim joints here, which is not a bad setup. However, we need to consider steering geometry, and it's sort of hard to see here with these PVC pipes in the way, but our track bar mount that comes with this whole truss swap kit that I installed, also from Barnes 4-wheel drive, mounts the track bar above the axle tube. It's in a good position. However, if I were going to mount the drag link way up here, I need to make sure that my track bar and drag link are on the same plane, meaning they're parallel, so that they move through the same plane through the articulation of the axle. And if the best way to do that is to make sure that your mounting location, so here's the mounting location, the axle side mounting location of my track bar, are about at the same level. So with it mounted here and my track bar mounted on the top hole, I think I'm going to achieve that. If I mounted it up here, then I would have to lift or raise that mounting location of the track bar pretty significantly, I think, in order to make it work. That would require a whole bunch of modification and fabrication. That just doesn't make sense to me. So this mounting location has a problem as well. There's always going to be some packaging restraints. As you can see here, this is why I like to use PVC pipe, so you can see how everything's going to fit. We have a clearance issue here with this sway bar mount. So this is an easy decision for me. I wasn't planning on using a sway bar. I much rather just cut this off than completely redo the track bar mount. So I think mounting it to the inside here and getting rid of this sway bar mount is going to be the easiest solution to me. If I ever end up running a sway bar, getting something fancy like an anti-rock, I could probably redo some sort of tab, you know, in here, and that's not that big a deal. So this is going to have to get cut off in order for this to clear, but once we do, it should have enough room to move. Now, on the frame side, we also have a small issue. My tie rod mounts here just fine. I shouldn't have an issue with that at all. And you can see my drag link here mounted to the bottom of the pitman arm with these high misalignment spacers. So there's safety misalignment spacers, I believe, because it's not a double shear here. It's not in between a bracket. But my track bar mount, this is the existing track bar mount that I put on here a long time ago. And it's beefy, but the problem is there's zero adjustability. And as you can see, my track bar is at a significantly steeper angle than my drag link. We have to fix that. So luckily, that provided frame side bracket should do that for me. If I cut off, and I think that's what I'm gonna do, cut off these tabs, you will notice that there's a whole bunch of bracing and stuff that I already put on here from a long time ago. So this is pretty good. I have no problem just welding this straight to there. So I think if I cut off these brackets and instead replace it with this mount, what I'll be able to do is lower the mounting location of the drag or the track bar down, and I should be able to get it to where it is more parallel with my drag link, and that I think is going to be money. Not only that, what it's also going to do, if you notice this, is that it's going to lengthen the track bar mount. Actually, I measured it, it should lengthen it by almost 4 inches, which is great because not only should they be mounted parallel, but in order for them to actually still move into the same plane, your drag link and your track bar, they should also be at as close as possible as the same length. Well, get this. Right now, this is about 3.5 inches longer than the track bar. And when I put that new frame side mount on, it's about 4. I mean, they're going to be really, really close to the same length, and they should be pretty parallel. So I think I'm going to start by cutting off these brackets and getting this frame side mount at least tacked up so I can get a better idea of all my steering angles and then make sure my geometry is going to work. Boy, I tell you, whenever you're cutting off brackets off the frame, especially big thick ones, and then you have to go back and clean it all up with a grinder, it is just a pain. I am covered in grinding dust, the shop's covered in grinding dust, and it just makes quite a mess. But we did get a few things cut off and a couple more things figured out. So if you notice, I did cut off the sway bar mount here on the passenger side, and I went ahead and cycled the steering, and this is clearing now completely. So we have plenty of room here. Now, the actual DOM tubing that we're going to be using for the drag link is a little bit thicker in diameter, so it might get kind of close, but worst case scenario, we just have to grind down a little bit more there, and we should be good to go. So that should not be a problem anymore. Now, on the frame side, we got our frame side track bar bracket, just with one simple little tack here just to hold it in place, because I'm not completely married to this yet. But this actually fit pretty darn good. We have this nice and square. I did have to modify this bracket slightly. So just this inside part here, I had to cut it down. And the reason why is it didn't want to sit square. And that's because my frame actually curves in here on the XJ to go around the coil spring, and so the thing was like wobbling. It didn't want to sit square, so all I simply had to do is just modify this bracket a little bit by cutting this down, and now it sits nice and square. And even got a pretty darn level track bar, so I'm pretty happy with the way that worked out. I mean, again, just DIY basic brackets. You don't even have to modify it that much, and it's going to do what I need it to do. And check this out. These turned out pretty darn close to being perfectly parallel, at least as close as I'm going to be able to get them here. I did end up having to put this in the very bottom hole, and so to get this thing to work out the way I needed it to, but we are pretty darn close. And this track bar tube is going to be only about a ½ inch shorter than the drag link. So I mean, this steering should actually drive, this thing should drive pretty good, and it certainly is not going to be any sort of problem in a trail rig. So I'm as happy, because that's about as close as I'm going to be able to get with this setup. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut out the tubing here for the track bar, this big 1/4 inch wall DOM tubing. Tack everything into place. Just take my piece of PVC pipe, take the exact same measurement, cut it down, get everything tacked in place, and as long as I'm super happy with it, burn it all in, and at least the track bar part of the steering should be buttoned up. Alright, well check it out. I believe our track bar should be about buttoned up here. We got our bracket all welded in. I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. I mean, we just sort of turned it up to 11 and burned that thing right in there. And you know, there's quite a bit of material here that's pretty thick, and so I'm pretty happy with the way that that turned out. And as far as the track bar itself, it goes in there and it fits pretty perfectly. So I should say, just really quickly, because I guess I haven't mentioned it before, but we are setting this thing up, you know, to making sure that our axle is still centered. So if you see, I have a chalk line right there on the axle. That is the center of the axle, and then we even have marks up here on the frame. I don't know if you can see them here. And so just using our cheap laser level, we're making sure that everything's still here, because even though we have some adjustment in the heim joints, we still want to set this thing up as close as possible to centered how this is going to sit. So as far as the rest of the steering goes, I got everything reattached again with all my mock-up pieces of PVC pipe in here. So for the tie rod, that should be no problem. Everything looks good. I'm pretty happy with the way that looks. I should just be able to pop that out, you know, cut out my tube, and then weld in my bungs and reinstall. But the drag link, I have discovered one more problem that needs our attention. So if you notice, we have our heim joint here mounted horizontally, because that's just how this system works. And if you can't really tell here, we are already, you know, we have a lifted Jeep, and while this thing is not lifted a crazy amount, we still have a fairly steep angle between our pitman arm down here to our steering knuckle. And so if you look, we are already at almost max misalignment. I mean, this thing is really close to, if you drop this axle down and begin lowering it down, that's probably going to bind. Now I could be mistaken, but I believe those are already a high misalignment spacer. And so this thing's already pretty much at max misalignment. So I think the easiest solution here though, to fix that so that this thing doesn't bind, is just to put a slight bend in the actual tube itself. Won't take much, but just a little bit of bend so that we can help level out the way that this sits, because at ride height we are already almost, almost touching at almost max misalignment. And if you think about it, pretty much all like aftermarket steering kits, even ones for like stock Cherokees, you will see a bend in the drag link if they're a Heim joint kit. And I think that's exactly the reason why, is what we're discovering right now, is that you just need that slight bend just to make sure you get the full movement when you have a Heim mounted horizontally. Now to make this bend, we're going to be using the trusty Harbor Freight tubing kinker or pipe kinker here, which I realize is not the right tool for the job, but you can actually get some pretty decent bends with this thing if you know what you're doing. So we don't need much of a bend, so I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem. Now all I did is I just took my piece of mock-up piping here, and I just sort of marked where I think I want the bend to start on the vehicle, and then I just traced that out here on the actual piece of tubing. And so I'm just going to throw this in the bender, center it up right there, and just kind of just slowly, bend it a little bit. I don't need too much of a bend here, and I definitely don't want to overdo it. And then we'll just go back to the Jeep and just kind of keep test fitting it to make sure that we have the bend that we want. Alright everyone, we got our steering all finished welded, installed and bolted up, and it looks pretty awesome. Now this does look a little unfinished, it's not painted, but that's because this axle does need to come out a few more times, and I didn't want to get it painted until final assembly. But it is all designed, laid out, and installed exactly how I want it, and I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. I think this steering not only looks good, but it should perform pretty well as well. We were able to get that tie rod and drag link almost perfectly parallel. In fact, once I started actually bolting everything down, I was able to move that drag link, or that tie rod I should say, even up one bolt hole. And that's about as parallel as I can get it. And that track bar is within a ½ inch as the same length as our drag link. So this thing should handle on and off road just fine, and I shouldn't have any bump steer or any binding. Now I was also able to cycle the suspension, or I should say cycle the steering, and we do have some close tolerances, but everything should clear, even that track bar mount. And that little bend that we put in the drag link should give my heim joint a lot more room to move around, so we're not on full misalignment. So this thing should perform well, but it should also hold up very well as well, because those components from Barnes 4-wheel drive are pure beef. The 7/8 heim joints coupled with all 3/4 hardware, not to mention the 1.5" by 1/4" wall DOM tubing. I mean, this steering setup should be able to handle any abuse I can give it off-road. So if you liked this video and you want to see more like them, please make sure that you give it a thumbs up, comment down below, and subscribe to our channel if you have not already. It's another step down in this swap process that has taken me a long time, but this is a big one because it's going to lead to, getting that front axle fully assembled and hopefully getting this thing on the road pretty soon. So if you are doing any projects like this, steering, suspension, anything to do with any sort of DIY or fabrication on your off-road rig, you have to go check out barnes4wheeldrive.com. I will leave a link in the description below, and if you want to save 10% on your purchase, use our discount code MuddyBeards at checkout. So until next time, we will see you on the trail.